Yeah, I know this, as I say, we've talked about it before, Lucinda. So I think now we're on the same page as that. But it is something which I have to say, when we look at riders riding in the dressage arena, perhaps one of the first things that I correct is I don't want to see the horses going along looking at the sand.
Yeah. Can I just jump in there? Ditto with all of that, and absolutely loved it. There's two points that I'd just like to provoke. Well, one point I'd like to provoke on, and the other one is when Chris was talking about self-carriage as well, what Carl and Charlotte have done for pure dressage, and that crosses over very much to us, and that pole up and face out. And that's, you know, with the pole up and face out on the flat, and as Chris said, not rolled over. The horse is then off the shoulders, but also their vision then is a completely different way that they look at things, and that's the way that you want them coming down to a fence. So it's so linked in, and you see when dressage is done, as Chris just said, in self-carriage, both physically and mentally, it's the same skill sets that you want coming around the corner to a fence. My other point that I'd like to go to there, I will just throw a little hand grenade in, because I love, as Chris will know where I'm going with this, in the scales of training for an event horse, and we can argue this through because all of the scales are very, very locked in, and it's a part of the jigsaw puzzle. But for me, with an event horse, the straightness comes before the impulsion in the scales of training, because of the very nature of what we are actually doing with our horses. So the back legs following the front legs. Even on a circle, the back legs must follow the front legs. And in that way, we know that the horse stays on the railway tracks, and biomechanically, he can shorten or lengthen. And we know that the horse's job is to avoid the fence, to avoid a skinny fence. If he's out through his shoulder, he loses the ability to shorten or lengthen. You see many brave horses that go cross country that run off a glance off a corner or a skinny. It's not because they're not brave. It's just the fact that their biomechanics will not let them shorten or lengthen when they're out through the shoulder and they're not straight. So that's my argument for straightness before impulsion with eventing. But it's such fine lines here, and it is all interconnected.
And for those of you that aren't absolutely conversant with the scales of training, which I'm not, the last one is collection in the German scale of training. The next one is straightness. The next one is impulsion. Dickie changes those around. His last one is collection. His next one is impulsion, because straightness comes more importantly before those other two. So that's what he's saying, that straightness is so key biomechanically for approaching a fence, that he inverts them on the German scale.
And just to jump back to something that Chris said earlier about the rider's thirst for knowledge and inquisitiveness. Chris and I and Lucinda are classic examples of that. And when John Ledenham came over and did a bit of coaching with us at one point, he went through the scales.
It sounded like John Lennon, but you meant John Ledingham.
Ledingham, yeah.
Irish, yes.
And so when John came over, he sort of went through the scales with the rider, and it provoked us to say, hang on a minute, you know, this is part of our basics, and we just need to revisit this. And what I often do, and for everyone that's listening in at the moment, when people come to me, they don't know the scales, I ask them to print 3 copies and laminate them. One for in their horse box, one for in their tap room, and one for their bedside locker. And you can look at the scales of training before you ride, or the evening just before you go to bed, or where you're in the horse box on the way to the show, and you can look through your scales and say, okay, I'm going to give myself a mark for where I am. We'll use straightness. I got a 6 today for straightness. So in my training tomorrow, how am I going to make that a 6.5 or a 7? So you can use the scales of training to self-coach. Where am I with rhythm? My rhythm keeps fluctuating. I'm on a 5. How can I get that to a 6? So the really easy way of doing some self-training and using the scales of training, using the basics.
And if I can just jump in there in relation to those 2 words, straightness, impulsion. My explanation, and I would agree with Dickie, the straightness has to come first. My clarification is that if one imagines a coiled spring, and what is impulsion? Impulsion, to pinch John's expression, is momentum compressed. And so as you have a coiled spring and try to compress that coiled spring, it is only possible to do so if you keep the coiled spring straight. So you put it in a tube, and then you can compress that coiled spring and fire the pellet or the potato or whatever out of the tube once you've got that compression. So yes, that aspect of straightness before impulsion, I think, is very much the direction that we're both on the same page about. And then, of course, the collection aspect, the ability to have different stride lengths, whether you be in the dressage arena riding between the letters on 3 strides, or medium canter 4 strides, or working canter 5 strides, or collected canter 6 strides, or even 7 strides. That ability to have a different stride length as a preparation, it'd be like changing gear in your car. You need to have those tools available as you move up the grades to the more technically challenging cross-country courses.
We have hit a pretty tricky time in the world with the financial crisis left, right, and centre for so many people. And it's a very expensive job to go out and train on a cross-country course and take yourself off to events. There's a lot that can be done at home. And if you do not have any cross-country fences, and I know, Dickie, you don't, and I know, Chris, you have a few in the back field there, but imagine those out there who don't have any and don't have enough money to keep going off and training, and probably don't have a trainer either. Where do you feel you can do so much to help cross-country training? And we're talking about not the very top level, although I think it applies to all, at home.
I think if I'll jump in first, Chris, but the first thing is you can do so much out hacking. Whether if you can find somewhere where you can hack off the roads and you use the topography and, you know, coming down a hill, up a hill, trotting down quietly, trotting down with a little bit more pace, using your own balance to and your own weight aid, cantering up and down hills, using the lumps and bumps. So all of that, never underestimate how much you can develop a horse. And I can't remember who told me this, but it was a really good way of putting it, that when we go skiing, and that first morning we put the skis back on, we haven't been for a while, our legs tend to go a bit wobbly, and we take, you know, an hour or so to sort of get your ski legs back. It must be the same for a horse when we work them on surfaces, and suddenly they have to go across country in mud this deep, and they've got to find those legs again. So it's really, really important that not everything is done in the arena. That's the first thing. The next point is, I made Lucinda, which you've seen. I didn't have, I mean, I'm very lucky now, I have Jump for Joy equipment, but I made nearly all of my own skinny fences. So, and even if you haven't got the ability to make them yourself, the timber didn't cost a lot of money, and I'm sure you could find a friend or someone who could put the fences together for you. But I made my own equipment to start with.
You hang up on wings in the arena.
That's right. Yeah,
they can go anywhere, and believe me, Dickie puts them anywhere.
and then the last thing that, you know, I don't want to keep going, so Chris can go as well, but I am a believer that to teach a horse to jump your skinnies, you can very easily teach a horse how to run out. That's the first thing. So I'm a big believer in doing those basics at home over your skinnies and over your corners. And then when you take it out into a cross-country schooling environment where they tend to be fixed obstacles, they already understand, and they all understand in your words, Lucinda, you know, the rider understands as well, is squeezing what did you used to say? Squeezing toothpaste out of a tube. Yeah. So, you know, as a rider, you get the skill sets, and the horse get the skill sets before you go and play around on fixed obstacles. So I find the arena stuff very useful, but it's definitely just a small part of preparation for cross-country training.
Great. What
no, I mean, that's all music to my ears. you know, in terms of the working the horses away from the arena and the surfaces and so on, I think is so important, and it's something which these days it becomes for a lot of riders more of a challenge to do that, and to find the places to go onto undulating terrain, onto through the woods or whatever, and all those little things like popping little roadside ditches and learning to slip the rein and pop things out of trot and so on. It's a skill which you know, riders very often actually get nervous about, but I'm a great believer in, is jumping out of trot, you know, because you don't have a predicted takeoff point, as it were. You can't see a sort of stride to a trot pop. So that's something which I think is very useful. And yeah, the point you've been both discussing about whether it be skinnies or corners and jumping fences on the angle and so on, is all about straightness. It's all about the horse understanding what I refer to as the language of touch. And I often talk about this to riders as a point of principle. At the end of the day, how do we communicate with a horse? We communicate mainly through the language of touch. Eyesight plays a small part. You can talk to your horse, you can click your tongue or whatever, so that was also a small part, but it's primarily the language of touch. Give your horse a polo at the end, that's taste, I suppose, so that's also a factor. And then in relation to that communication system with the horse, it has to start with the rider's position statement, as it were. I always talk about the position statement. If you're going to go left, you've got to sit on the left-hand side of the saddle. If you're going to go right, you've got to sit on the right-hand side of the saddle. And then your body language communicates to the horse. And so your eye, where you're looking, and particularly looking through the flags to a point behind the skinny, behind the corner, is so important, not to just stare at the fence itself. And then along with those elements we talked about straightness, well, how do you keep your horse straight? You keep your horse straight by the touch of your leg and having the leg in the right place and keeping the head, neck, shoulders, body, hips, tail all in line. And I always say, in that order of communicating, position statement, body language, seat has an influence, leg has an influence, and then finally, I always say, finally the hand. And in respect to the hand, it's not about pulling the horse on the turn, it's about bringing the horse on the turn through position statement, body language, seat and leg. And the outside rein, I always say, is the disciplining rein. And when a horse does run past a fence, whether it be a skinny or a corner, yeah, I often see riders making the mistake of getting cross with their horse and smacking it or pulling it or whatever, when fundamentally the problem is a misunderstanding, in the sense that the horse is not staying straight and not seeing that the line is in a particular point to somewhere behind the fence, as it were. So it's not about smacking or pulling the horse. It's about perhaps going back to some leg yielding, getting understanding from the leg that we're staying, as we talked about, that tube of toothpaste between your legs to keep the horse channeled and straight. I could go on and on. So
I know, and you talked about music to your ears. It's such music to mine. Dickie, you want to say something?
Yeah, we're talking about systems and scales of training, and you know, Lucinda, I have 3 very, very simple rules. But what I will say, from those rules, they have sub-paragraphs. But the rules are very simple. First of all, the rider must sit in balance. And I include in the balance, as Chris was talking about, the touch aids, but that's the leg in the correct position, heels down. I'm going into sub-paragraphs now, but the rider must sit in balance. Secondly, the rider must then put the horse into the correct way of going for the question in hand. And I always say the question in hand, not the obstacle in hand, because the way that you position obstacles will, and where they're placed, will need a different ways of going, or different way of going. So the rider must sit in balance. must put the horse in the correct way of going for the question in hand. And then the last part of my 3 rules are they must provide the line.
Must
So the
provide,
horse provide the line. So the horse
rider
understands.
must provide the line.
Provide that, yeah. So the rider must provide the line. Now that includes, it comes down, they're all interlocked. It includes, as Chris was just saying earlier, the connection with the leg, so the touching aid, a connection with the hand, from the leg to the hand. It includes making sure that in the correct way of going that the horse is straight. So when he comes round a turn and you're providing the line, that you've not lost him through the shoulders. So all those 3 rules are very simplistic, but they all have sub-paragraphs. We can say the correct way of going for a chase fence is different for the correct way of going maybe for a coffin fence. So but they're 3 very simplistic rules. And I've heard Chris from time to time say, you know, he would ask, right, which rule did you break? So you can self-coach. And invariably, if you stick to the rules, the outcome looks after itself. If you break one of those rules, it's very easy to self-coach and say, actually, I did fall in round the corner. I didn't provide the correct line, or I wasn't straight, or I didn't have the correct way of going. Simplistic way of looking at it, but it seems to work.
It's beautiful to hear you both talk. I have a very simple word that I use, which is elbow, which stands for your jobs as a rider are engine, line and balance. And the OW of elbow is owl if you forget one of them. And I say those are your 3 jobs, which broadly speaking, we're all saying the same thing in different ways. And the horse's job is to find his spot. And I know that you, Chris, feel very strongly about if you have the correct canter, the horse is never that wrong. He can find his way over the fence.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have 2 expressions that are relevant there. One, I always say, impulsion and balance give your horse options. You don't have to have a perfect spot if the horse has impulsion and balance. And go back to the point we talked about, straightness, of course, is an important aspect of impulsion because you haven't got it without straightness. Yeah, there was something else flashed through my mind for a second and it's disappeared. I'll have to come back to it, but yeah, I'll hand back to you because my moment of inspiration is
come back. It will come back. I tell you something I was interested in hearing. It's really, really fascinating for me to hear you both talk, saying what I believe, but in different ways. And it's wonderful descriptions that you use, and that's what's so invaluable for us who are listening. I have never seen either of you using wings. And I may have got this wrong because I haven't watched you train a lot. And some people do because they say you must never teach a horse he can run out, which I totally agree. There are 2 options he must never learn, that he cannot stop and he cannot run out. But I don't want to use wings unless I've hit an impasse, and I've got to because he keeps running out, because I want the rider to be those wings. I want the rider to understand what it feels like to keep this straightness that you're so strong about. Do you feel that's a fair enough way of going about training, not using wings?
Yeah, I mean, that I have